I'm excited to get started with this discussion on the use of quantum computing for drug discovery and other pharmaceutical innovations. And we have an amazing panel here for you. And I just want to jump right in and get started with Carl. Carl, you head the quantum computing practice group at Accenture. And one of the interesting things that I know your group is involved with is the use of quantum optimization algorithms for pharma applications. And I'd love to just kind of start with that and talk to us a little bit about how Accenture is using optimization in this field.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. One of the things that we did several years ago was we worked with Biogen and 1Qubit to use one of their methods that leverages optimization for molecular comparison or molecular analysis. So this is something very early on in the drug discovery process for finding the right molecules that can potentially successfully make it through the process. So we did a lot of work to benchmark this quantum-inspired method against classical techniques that are used today, such as fingerprinting. And we found that in some cases, we can get more higher quality results than what the classical technologies are doing today. However, it doesn't run at the speed and the throughput that is available through some of the other methods. And so it's a positive for these quantum methods, and it's a very interesting case study, and we're still working to make sure that it will eventually be something super beneficial as the quantum devices advance.
Great. So, and I want to kind of segue from that because I know that a lot of this group are really approaching this problem of discovery in different ways. So, Mark, I want to move to you. And I know that your company is looking at protein structure prediction and even designing proteins. How are you applying quantum computing now to these problems?
Sure. Basically, like one of the kind of main differences between what we're doing and what a lot of others are doing is that we exclusively focus on proteins. So the types of problems that we're interested in tend to be a little bit different than the problems that you might encounter when working with small molecules. So initially, we kind of started off looking into how quantum computing could help speed up or enable the folding of larger proteins, as well as kind of the prediction of how a drug molecule fits into a binding site. And so early on in the company, we kind of started working with D-Wave as well as Rigetti, figuring out different ways of mapping protein folding to these devices. And then later on partnered with Xanadu to kind of look at the molecular docking problem using their photonic chips. And we really think that there's a lot of value when it comes to speeding up these computations because they tend to be extremely resource intensive. And being able to kind of outsource or kind of leverage some of the quantum advantage in the where the computational bottlenecks lie, that's where we think we can actually provide value, essentially by building quantum classical hybrid algorithms.
Got it. That makes sense. And I think, Benno, this is similar to some of what you're doing in the simulation field. And curious if you could maybe build on what Mark's talking about and explain to us what you and your company are doing in terms of making these types of simulations. I understand you're even doing it to a certain extent at the atom by atom scale.
Yeah, thanks for the intro and thanks for that question. Indeed, one of the things we are focusing on is developing these novel quantum-enhanced methods for computing binding affinities, which is one of the topics that Mark just also mentioned. More specifically, we are then focusing on small molecule covalent inhibitors. And I mean small molecule because this makes it somewhat more realistic to be able to fit these types of simulations on midterm quantum processors, and covalent because to properly model those type of bindings, you need to include the reactivity between the ligand and the receptor. So that's where the quantum mechanics comes in. So indeed, we're doing some of that work, but we're also combining quantum chemistry simulations with more quantum enhanced machine learning to focus more on de novo molecular design, which is also an interesting field within drug discovery. So yeah, plenty of stuff to do in the next coming years.
So you mentioned the quantum enhanced machine learning, and I know Hans, this is a big part of what your company is focused on. So can you talk a little bit about, with all the advances in machine learning, and you hear a lot about, more co-processing and things like that in kind of the classical computing world. With your work at your company, what does quantum bring to the table when it comes to machine learning, particularly for these kind of applications?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So at Menten, we've been really focused on the protein design part. So not so much the folding, but more the design. So starting from scratch, how can we design a protein or a peptide that binds to a drug of interest, a drug target of interest? And so within the pipeline, there are parts where classical computing does great. There are parts where traditional machine learning works beautifully. But there are parts where they just come a little bit short. Parts, for example, with combinatorial optimization, right? How we navigate a very complex and massive landscape, right? This is the kind of problem where classical algorithms really struggle. And it's one of the key parts where we have been focusing on to actually navigate this using quantum algorithms. So we let classical algorithms do what they're good at. We let machine learning, classical machine learning, do what it's good at. And those key problems where they really struggle, that's where we bring quantum. And so we've been integrating quantum into this workflow. And so far, we've seen a lot of promise. Very exciting work.
So when you say promise in this vein, and I think maybe I'm being a business reporter, looking at the bottom line, are we talking, are we solving these problems faster? Is it more accurate? Is it, getting us more complex answers than we could do with classical? Like, what looks promising to you? Just kind of on that real base level.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are two key things that we look at. One, of course, is the speed. Can we solve these problems faster? And second, can we get different answers, right? And this is important because remember, this is a huge space that we're exploring, right? And classical methods are infamous for getting stuck in local minimum, right? And quantum computers, if they have some advantage, they may be able to kick us out of this local minima and explore this vast space. So what I mean promising is, for example, sometimes we begin to see solutions that are very different from what we get with classical methods. So right at this point, we don't see yet a speed advantage, but we begin to see some usefulness, if you will, some practicality to using quantum.
So, and on a similar note, Mark, I know that your company is employing a lot of, I think you mentioned a lot of hybrid algorithms. Can you talk a little bit about how, those are kind of practically being useful for the work you're doing?
Yeah, before answering that question, I'd like to kind of add to Hans's reply that for us, it's not so much about speed, but something that we care about is kind of unlocking new chemical space. Because a lot of the traditional kind of protein design software is very much focused on the 20 natural amino acids, whereas we're trying to kind of expand that and incorporate hundreds of new non-natural amino acids that are very difficult to model with traditional tools. And we're hoping to kind of implement them with classical as well as quantum hybrid models. In terms of how hybrid models benefit us, I guess, in the long run, or even in the next 5 to 8 years, I'm not really expecting at all to outsource a whole computation to a quantum device, but it's really always just kind of identifying the bottleneck and outsourcing that small computation to the quantum device, but just kind of, as Hans mentioned, let the classical device do all the things that it is good at and really just use the quantum for the bottlenecks. So we haven't seen any drastic advantage with any of that right now, but I think if the devices scale in the next 2 to 3 years, we might be able to see something.
And Carl, with your work at Accenture, I know a lot of your customers are probably interested in kind of the same kind of bottom line. So would you agree with what Mark and Hans have been saying about where we're at right now with quantum? Do you see certain areas where there are better advantages now? What's kind of the perspective from the work you're doing?
I'd say absolutely. In machine learning and in chemistry simulation, these hybrid approaches are very important, working with classical technologies and then figuring out which part of a machine learning workflow you can outsource to quantum to get some different type of result is the approach that I think the majority of people are taking right now. Optimization has kind of got its own flavors of running on pure quantum devices versus running on annealing devices versus running on digital annealing devices, and then figuring out, because you can run some of these things at larger scale, what's the business value going to be today, or when will that be achieved? It enables a completely different conversation, is what I would put there.
Mm-hmm. And Benno, I want to talk to you a little bit because I know your work is kind of hitting all of these different angles. But I know that you had stepped back and you've got a really kind of broad breadth of experience. And I'm curious to know, what is it about the potential for quantum computing, whether it's right now or what you see happening a couple years down the road, that really makes you excited? Like, what is the thing that you think is really going to show off the potential for quantum computing in this biotech pharma space?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I mean, the value of in silico methods in general, like computational methods in general, in the pharma sector, it comes partially from like time and cost savings in the discovery and preclinical phases, like the stuff that we've discussed already in this session. But I think more importantly, we should also focus on developing methods to significantly reduce the drug rejection rates during clinical trials. I mean, that is by far the most costly phase of developing a new drug. And at the moment, I think it's about 10 or 20% of all drugs entering clinical trials that make it to an approved and marketable drug. So that's a pretty poor performance of that process. So an interesting challenge for quantum would be to improve the predictive modeling to actually prevent negative surprises during these clinical trials. So, I mean, wouldn't it be great if future computational methods, like including quantum, could help increase the approval rate to, I don't know, above 50%. That would be really groundbreaking, have a huge impact on the sector. So those type of like perspectives and those type of promises, that makes me really enthusiastic about being in this field and trying to apply quantum in practice to this type of sector.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think rejection during clinical trials feels like it's more urgent now with a global pandemic on the horizon and this real rush to develop vaccines and treatments and other things. And, Hans, I want to kind of segue into that. I know that your company is doing a little bit of work on COVID-19, and you want to talk a little bit about how you're approaching some of the problems that have come about in the last few months, maybe with an eye to looking at the clinical trial process that Benno alludes to.
Sure, definitely. So I guess I'll just take a couple of minutes to summarize our approach there. So as you guys might have seen, the spike protein of COVID effectively works by infecting human cells through a receptor called the ACE2 receptor. So if we can block that spike protein from attacking the ACE2 receptor, well, we have a way of stopping this. One of the ways of creating something that binds and stops this spike protein is effectively a peptide. And so the team, even before COVID, we have been looking into infectious diseases. And then when COVID happened, it was like, well, this is the opportunity and the time to do this. And so, for us, it's just a matter of having a crystal structure, doing some design in the pipeline. And then once we have some designs, we send those over for actual wet lab testing. So the way we've done this is in a few different pipelines. The first pipeline is kind of, machine learning, straightforward, classical. And then somewhere along the line, the second batch of design, we actually saw that, we can actually optimize this using quantum computing. In this case, quantum annealing, a hybrid approach, I should say. And so we have now a second batch of designs that, in fact, have quantum in the loop, right? And just to be perfectly clear, I'm not claiming an advantage at this point, right? But we begin to see some actual use of these technologies, right? And as Benno was saying, if we extrapolate this to 3, 5, 10 years, right, then we may actually begin to see some real advantage to these technologies. So it's really exciting work.
Yeah, that's great. And speaking of optimization, Carl, I know that some of the optimization problems that your group is looking at is not the optimization necessarily of drug development, although I'm sure you're doing that too, but the optimization of the supply chain in handling the pandemic. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about what Quantum might be able to bring to the field there, especially as I'm sure we start to see a lot of these treatments or vaccines ramping up in production and distribution.
Yeah, so we have done a lot of work in supply chain optimization, breaking down those problems, working with other teams in Accenture to understand the sophistication that companies actually deal with in the field and how they solve the problems classically today, and compiling those back into quantum models and methods. We've considered some things about vaccine distribution and where these new ideas can be applied. We haven't done anything out there yet, but it is something that we're interested in. We're talking about. We're trying to connect the dots and figure out how it fits. So it's an exciting field as well.
Yeah, I always like the little nuts and bolts problems. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
I want to ask Carl, when you say supply chain, is that about the logistics of delivering molecules to customers, or is it actually also about kind of the synthesis of molecules and production processes and stuff like that?
No, we're talking about literal supply chain. So optimization of packages going on trucks, which routes the trucks take to get to deliver the vaccine, or what other materials we're trying to deliver, those types of things. And they can be done locally and solve really, really well. But as you ramp up the problem, it becomes impossible to solve with classical technologies at larger scales. And that's why we're looking to see quantum. A 1% improvement in optimization across supply chain is huge for the industry. They just need tiny, tiny improvements, and it's a big deal.
Cool.
And I'm curious, so we've just a minute left, but wanted to jump to you, Mark, because you had actually told me you made a conscious choice, not to shift course and look at the pandemic, but keep with your kind of long-term vision for the company. Wanted to know if you could kind of explain the thinking behind that, because I did find it interesting and would love to hear more.
I guess there's two things that we considered. The first thing is that we're currently really swamped with customer projects, and we just couldn't really afford putting people on COVID-19 research whilst we're having to deliver on our partnerships. And at the same time, we also believe that a vaccine is going to be available way sooner than a potential treatment would be. And as soon as a vaccine is available, the treatment is not really going to provide any more value. And that's why for ProteinQure, we just decided to kind of double down on our customer projects and keep focusing on those.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, there's always, I think, this rush of immediacy and whenever something new comes up, and being able to stay focused, especially when you're dealing with a long-term field like pharmaceutical companies, is important. So I think we could go on talking forever, but I want to thank all of the panelists here for the discussion, and stay tuned for more at the Q2B conference.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank you
Alex.
so much.
Thank you.